Lakeville, Indiana, in the late 1980s was the epitome of small-town America, a place where life moved at a gentle pace and community bonds were strong. Among its most respected residents were the Pelley family. Robert Pelley, a former IT professional turned pastor, led the Olive Branch Church with a steady hand and a kind heart. His wife, Dawn, embraced her role as a supportive partner and loving mother, caring for their blended family, which included Robert's children from a previous marriage and their own children together. The Pelley family was seen as a model of stability and moral fortitude, embodying the values that the town held dear. Robert's sermons were well attended, and the family's participation in church events and community activities made them highly visible figures in Lakeville. Their home, located near the church, often buzzed with activity, filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of family life. On the morning of April 30th, 1989, the serene life of the Pelley family and the town of Lakeville was shattered. When the Pelley family failed to show up for Sunday services at Olive Branch Church, concern quickly spread among the congregation. It was highly unusual for Robert, as the pastor, to miss a service, especially without any notice. Members of the church decided to check on the family at their home, fearing that something was amiss. What they discovered was beyond anything they could have imagined. Inside the Pelley residence, the scene was one of horror. Robert, Dawn, and their two daughters, Janelle and Jolene, were found brutally murdered. Each had been shot at close range, their bodies left in different parts of the house. The crime was both calculated and cold-blooded, with no immediate signs of forced entry or robbery. The murders sent shockwaves through the community. Lakeville was a place where people left their doors unlocked and knew their neighbors by name. The idea that such a heinous act could occur within their town was almost incomprehensible. Grief and fear gripped the residents, who struggled to reconcile the brutal reality of the crime with the peaceful life they had always known. As news of the massacre spread, media attention descended upon Lakeville, turning the quiet town into the center of a nationwide tragedy. The investigation into the murders began swiftly, but as the police delved deeper into the family's lives, the case took unexpected turns that would leave the town grappling for answers for years to come. In the immediate aftermath of the Pelley family murders, the shockwaves rippled through the small town of Lakeville. The brutal killing of Pastor Robert Pelley, his wife Dawn, and their two daughters, Janelle and Jolene, was unimaginable for the tight-knit community. The investigation began with intense scrutiny as the police sought to piece together what had happened on that fateful day in April 1989. Attention soon turned to the Pelley family's surviving members, specifically Jeff Pelley, the eldest son from Robert's previous marriage. At 17 years old, Jeff had not been at home during the time the murders were believed to have occurred. Instead, he was reportedly at the high school prom, an event that, in a tragic twist, seemed to mark a turning point in the investigation. Jeff's absence from the family home and his presence at the prom raised questions and suspicions. Robert Pelley had reportedly clashed with Jeff over his desire to attend the prom. The disagreements between father and son had escalated in the weeks leading up to the event, culminating in Robert forbidding Jeff from going unless certain conditions were met. This familial tension became a focal point for investigators, who theorized that the argument may have spiraled into something far more sinister. Jeff's behavior, both before and after the prom, became a subject of intense scrutiny. Witnesses recalled seeing Jeff at the prom and other events that evening, but gaps in the timeline of his activities raised further questions. Investigators found it difficult to establish a clear and consistent alibi for Jeff during the crucial hours when the murders took place. Moreover, some of Jeff's actions after the crime, such as returning home and retrieving his car from the driveway, appeared calculated to the authorities, who speculated he might have been attempting to cover his tracks. As the investigation deepened, the police also gathered testimony from Jeff's friends and acquaintances, many of whom described a strained relationship between Jeff and his father. These testimonies painted a picture of a young man at odds with his strict and authoritative father, which added to the suspicion that Jeff might have acted out in a fit of rage. Despite this mounting circumstantial evidence, the investigators faced a significant challenge. There was no direct evidence linking Jeff to the murders. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, and no eyewitnesses tied him to the crime scene. The case against Jeff was entirely built on circumstantial factors, and without definitive proof, the police could not bring charges. As a result, the investigation stalled, and the case grew cold, leaving the town in a state of uncertainty and fear. The possibility that a killer was still at large kept the community on edge, and for years, the unanswered questions about the Pelley Family Massacre loomed over Lakeville like a dark cloud. Years passed after the horrific murders of the Pelley family, leaving the case cold and the community of Lakeville haunted by the unanswered questions. The shocking nature of the crime, combined with the lack of concrete evidence, had left the police stymied. However, the advent of new forensic techniques and the rise of specialized cold case units in the early 2000s breathed new life into many long-dormant investigations, including the Pelley Family Massacre. In 2002, the case was officially reopened. A team of dedicated investigators, armed with more advanced tools and a fresh perspective, began to re-examine the evidence. The decision to revisit the case was spurred not only by technological advancements, but also by the persistent hope that justice could finally be served for the slain family members. The investigators meticulously reviewed the case files, re-interviewed witnesses, and re-examined every piece of evidence that had been collected from the Pelley home. This included looking at physical evidence through a new lens, hoping that modern forensic science might uncover clues that had been missed or deemed inconclusive in 1989. Advances in DNA analysis, ballistic testing, and crime scene reconstruction were now at their disposal, providing opportunities to potentially link the crime to a perpetrator. During this renewed investigation, Jeff Pelley once again became a person of interest. His strained relationship with his father, coupled with his alibi's inconsistencies, raised red flags. The investigators focused on discrepancies in Jeff's accounts and behaviors, such as the precise timing of his departure for prom and the nature of his interactions with friends and family before and after the murders. They paid close attention to his demeanor and actions, both at the time of the crime and in the years that followed. Investigators also reviewed statements from Jeff's friends and acquaintances, seeking to understand his state of mind during that tumultuous period. They scrutinized his relationship dynamics and explored whether the ongoing conflict with his father could have escalated to violence. In doing so, they aimed to either solidify or dismiss the theory that Jeff had motive and opportunity to commit the crime. As the investigation progressed, the authorities found what they believed to be enough circumstantial evidence to make an arrest. The renewed focus on Jeff Pelley culminated in his arrest in 2002, nearly 13 years after the murders. This development was a turning point, as it reopened old wounds for the Lakeville community and set the stage for what would become a highly publicized and contentious trial. The trial of Jeff Pelley was a dramatic and emotionally charged event that drew significant attention, not just from the Lakeville community, but from media outlets nationwide. The courtroom became a battleground where the prosecution and defense laid out their cases in painstaking detail, each side determined to sway the jury to their perspective. The stakes were incredibly high. On one side, the state sought justice for the brutal murders of the Pelley family, and on the other, Jeff Pelley fought to prove his innocence and avoid spending the rest of his life behind bars. The prosecution's strategy centered around a narrative that depicted Jeff as a troubled teenager with a strained relationship with his father, Robert Pelley. They argued that a dispute over Jeff attending prom was the final straw in an ongoing conflict. According to the prosecution, Jeff, in a fit of rage, grabbed a shotgun and methodically murdered his father, stepmother, and 2 younger sisters before calmly leaving for his prom night activities. They painted Jeff as a cold and calculating killer who was capable of carrying out such an atrocity without a shred of remorse. To bolster their case, the prosecution presented circumstantial evidence that, when pieced together, suggested Jeff's guilt. This included the timeline of the events, witness testimonies about the contentious relationship between Jeff and his father, and Jeff's behavior on the night of the prom. One of the most damning pieces of evidence, according to the prosecution, was the fact that Jeff left for the prom shortly after the time the murders were believed to have taken place, a decision they argued was indicative of his attempt to establish an alibi. The defense, however, mounted a vigorous argument against the prosecution's claims. They contended that the case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, without any concrete proof directly linking Jeff to the crime scene. No physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no gunshot residue tied Jeff to the murders. They emphasized the lack of a murder weapon being found and the absence of any direct witness to the crime. The defense team also pointed out that the investigation had overlooked other potential suspects and theories, suggesting that the police had rushed to judgment in focusing solely on Jeff. Throughout the trial, the defense sought to humanize Jeff, portraying him as a teenager caught in a tragic situation, not a killer. They highlighted his good character, his friends, and the lack of any history of violence or criminal behavior. The defense argued that the state had failed to meet the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and they implored the jury to carefully consider the gaps and inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Each day brought new revelations, witness testimonies, and emotional responses from those present. The media coverage intensified, with reporters and commentators debating the case's merits and the potential outcome. The trial became more than just a legal proceeding. It was a community reckoning, as Lakeville grappled with the possibility that one of its own could be capable of such a horrific crime. Ultimately, the jury was left with the daunting task of sifting through the evidence, testimony, and arguments presented over the course of the trial. Their decision would not only determine Jeff Pelley's fate, but also bring some measure of resolution to a community that had been haunted by the brutal murders for nearly 2 decades. After a long and arduous trial, the jury found Jeff Pelley guilty of the murders, marking the end of a grueling journey for both the prosecution and defense. The conviction brought a mixture of relief and sorrow to the small community of Lakeville. Many residents felt a sense of justice being served, believing that the conviction would finally put the horrific events of 1989 to rest. However, the trial also reopened old wounds, bringing the painful memories of that tragic day back to the surface. The courtroom was filled with an overwhelming sense of emotion as the verdict was read. Family members, friends, and community members who had attended the trial were visibly moved. Some wept openly, mourning not only for the lives lost, but also for the life that would now be spent behind bars. Jeff Pelley was sentenced to 160 years in prison, a term that essentially meant he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated. For the prosecution, this was a victory. For the defense, it was a bitter defeat. Despite the jury's decision, not everyone in Lakeville was convinced of Jeff's guilt. The case, built largely on circumstantial evidence, left room for doubt in the minds of some. The defense had raised significant questions during the trial, pointing out the lack of physical evidence directly tying Jeff to the murders. No DNA, fingerprints, or gunshot residue was found that could conclusively place him at the scene during the crime. This absence of direct evidence led some to wonder if the true perpetrator had slipped through the cracks. For Jeff, the conviction meant a life of appeals and continued protestations of his innocence. His defense team vowed to continue fighting, believing that an injustice had occurred. Over the years, several attempts were made to overturn the conviction, but each was met with the same result. The courts upheld the jury's verdict. For the families of the victims, the conviction provided a sense of closure, albeit incomplete. They found some solace in knowing that someone had been held accountable for the brutal murders, even as they grappled with the persistent questions and doubts that lingered. The community, too, began to heal, though the scars of the tragedy would never fully disappear. The Pelley Family Massacre was a story that left an indelible mark on Lakeville, a haunting reminder of the fragility of peace and the shadow that violence can cast over even the most serene places. In the years that followed, the case remained a topic of debate and reflection, not just for those in Lakeville, but for true crime enthusiasts and legal experts across the country. It became a symbol of the complexities and challenges of the justice system, illustrating how difficult it can be to find truth and deliver justice in the wake of such devastating crimes.